Hi, my name is John, and today I'll be talking about how to answer multiple choice poetry questions. If you're a student looking to answer poetry questions and you want to get the majority or all of the questions correct, it is first important to understand the key points to consider when trying to answer these types of questions. In this video, I'll be discussing the 5 key steps students should generally follow when trying to answer these types of questions. Let's get into it. The first step is to read the poem carefully and thoroughly. This means taking your time to understand the poem and all of its elements, including the structure, language, and tone. Paying attention to these elements will help you have a better understanding of the poem before moving on to the next step. It is important to follow this step because if you ignore it, you may miss important information and details that could impact your understanding of the poem and ultimately affect your ability to answer the questions correctly. A helpful tip for this step is to read the entire poem first before going to the questions. If you don't understand it, read it again before moving on to the next step. For more complex poems or poems that might have multiple interpretations, it is important to read it multiple times when necessary, but we just have to keep it practical and efficient, especially in a test environment. This will give you a better understanding of the poem if you read it more than once and help you remember the details if you go line by line. For example, let's look at the poem When You Are Old by W.B. Yeats. When you first read the poem, you can pay attention to its structure. It is written in rhyming couplets and the rhyming scheme is ABBA. You also want to pay attention to the language used in the poem, as Yeats uses a lot of imagery, metaphor, similes, etc. to convey the poem's message. Finally, the tone of the poem is one of sadness and regret. The second step is to identify the main idea and key themes of the poem. This step requires you to think critically about the poem and what the author is trying to convey. Understanding the main idea and key themes will help you have a better understanding of the poem and its message. This can be done if you are reading the poem. A helpful tip here is to write down the main idea and the key themes of the poem. This will help you to remember the information and also make it easier for you to refer back to when answering the questions. In a test environment, you don't have to write down complete sentences when you are writing down the idea and the themes. So when writing down these information, write it next to the poem itself or another sheet of paper as succinctly as possible that makes sense to you. In the case of When You Are Old, the main idea of the poem is the speaker's encouragement to the reader to remember their past and the love they shared. The key themes include love, regret, sadness, and the passage of time. I will not be writing the key themes as love and compassion in complete sentences. Instead, I will only write one word, love, and compassion or sadness. This is all I need because knowing the main idea and themes of the poem is only for my benefit. It will not be marked as it is a multiple choice test. If it was an open-ended response and each question had multiple marks, which is typically what is done in high school in certain exams in school, then you can't really be doing this approach. Writing in complete sentences probably will make a bit more sense here. The third step is to analyze the poem line by line, noting any literary techniques or figurative language used. This step will help you understand the meaning behind the words in the poem and will help you contribute to the overall message of what it's actually talking about. Understanding the literary techniques or devices used in the poem will help you have a better understanding of the poem and its message. In a perfect world, you can draw arrows for certain techniques and underline certain techniques and write it down and to ensure you have a technique in every line, and that will help you for sure understand what is going on. But in a test environment and what is required in poetry, this is not needed in multiple choice poetry questions. Only identify and keep those techniques in your mind if you have enough experience. Generally, if you needed a technique in every line, this is kind of required in the senior years in high school, and it is a skill that needs to be mastered as early as possible. I personally only got great in identifying techniques and a variety of techniques very quickly and efficiently in my older years of high school in years 10 to year 12. So if you're in primary school and junior high school, you can only identify a couple of different literary techniques, that's totally fine. If you can't find one for every line, that's okay, but just know that as you get older, it is a skill that you have to master. But let's use the poem as an example, When You Are Old. Yeats uses many literary techniques to convey the message of the poem. For example, in the very first line of the poem, when you are old and grey and full of sleep, it is an example of imagery. The line creates a vivid picture of the reader in the future, which sets the tone of the rest of the poem. Additionally, the line "and bending down besides the glowing bars" is an example of a metaphor, as the bars symbolize the barriers between the speaker and the reader. You can do this by underlining the line with the technique and writing the technique next to it in terms of an arrow. But over time, if you can just underline the line and you can read it back when you're double checking any of your questions, you'll be able to recognize if it's a metaphor, imagery, personification quite quickly by yourself. So all you need to do is underline it and you'll be able to refer it, as opposed to underlining and then writing the technique, which eats up into your test time. The fourth step is more optional, as it is not the most practical in an exam, but I included it anyway for your benefit in case you wanted to know everything about this process. This is to consider the context of the poem, such as the author's background and the time period in which the poem was written in. This step is important because it can give you a deeper understanding of the poem and its meaning if you understand where the author is coming from. For example, if the author is known to talk about a particular topic, or if the poem was written during a specific time period, this information can give you a little bit more insight in terms of the poem's message that the author is trying to convey. This will be useful for exams where you know that the poem will be given in like Year 7 or 8. If you know that you're studying Australian poetry, then the poems that you talk about might be about Australia in the past. So understanding about the historical context of Australia and some of the most famous poets in Australia, you'll probably be able to identify where the author is coming from, especially if you're given an unseen text. So if you're given an unseen text from an Australian poet, you can keep their context and the author's background in mind when answering the questions, whether they're talking about a particular Australian animal or anything like that, you'll be able to understand it much more easily. When considering the context of a poem, it is helpful to research the author and the time period in which the poem was written in. This can include reading biographical information about the author, as well as learning about the cultural, political, and historical events of that time period. By taking the time to consider the context of the poem, you can gain a deeper understanding of the poem's message and how it relates to the author's life and the world around them. This can help you understand the poem and make you have more informed decisions when answering the multiple choice questions that surround that poem. If it's a random poem that's given to you, like in the New South Wales selective exam, where you don't know if it's going to be an Australian poem or a poem in whichever era, this tip cannot really be used effectively. This is only going to be very efficient in junior high school generally, when you're given a poetry task throughout the year and you're given an unseen text. The final step is to compare and contrast the answer choices to determine which one best fits the poem. This step requires you to use the information you have gathered from the first 4 steps to make an informed decision. This is more of an exam technique that can apply to all multiple choice style questions and not necessarily only for poetry, but you can still keep this in mind. When comparing and contrasting the answer choices, it is important to go back to the poem and the information you have gathered about it. This can include rereading the poem, reviewing your notes on the main idea and the key themes, and referring to the context of the poem. By carefully comparing and contrasting the answer choices, you can ensure that you are selecting the answer that best fits the poem and its message. For questions that are opposite to the answer, you might be able to instantly remove that answer option as part of your consideration. Oftentimes, there'll be 2 options that are closest to the answer, so trying to remove the obvious answers that are definitely incorrect is crucial in allowing the students to have more time in answering the question. In conclusion, these 5 steps are great to keep in mind when trying to answer multiple choice poetry questions. By following these steps, you can ensure you have a thorough understanding of the poem and are able to make a more informed decision when selecting the correct answer. This is by no means the only steps you can follow, but I think it becomes a great framework to you to give it a go, especially if you are quite new to this and you don't really have a particular technique that you follow. Not all the steps will be applicable in a test setting, and if you take your time for every single step, it can eat up on your time. So make sure you pick and choose what works for you and focus on what allows you to succeed and maximize your marks. I hope this video has been helpful for you in your studies, and these practice tips will assist you in your future poetry analysis. Like this video if you haven't already, as it goes a long way in sharing this video to new students and helps us achieve our mission to help students around Australia and around the world. And if you haven't subscribed, make sure to subscribe. I'm trying to post a video every week, every second week, about a topic that I think is underutilized and misunderstood, and I wish I was taught this when I was younger. Anyway, thank you guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye.